What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am honored to be here with Lauren Whearty, a Philly-based painter, educator, and curator who currently teaches at the University of the Arts and Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Philadelphia. Over the course of the conversation, we talk about Lauren's studio and domestic-inspired paintings, her navigation through the art world, and her experience as co-director of Ortega y Gasset Gallery in New York City. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am so excited to connect with Lauren Whearty. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. It's such an honor. I love the work that you do, not only for your art practice, but for the art community in general.
Nice. Thank you so much for having me. This is exciting.
Yeah, of course. So I definitely want to talk about your work as a curator and co-director of Ortega y Gasset, which is located in New York City. But to start, I'd love to talk about your own art practice. Let's start really kind of broadly. So it seems like your paintings are heavily rooted in the still life. So maybe we could start by talking about your chosen subject matter.
Sure. So in the beginning, like maybe say after grad school, I wasn't working with still life. I was working with a lot of invented landscapes and just trying to find what my subject really was. And where that ended up was with a lot of invention. So I was trying to create compositions of things I couldn't actually see. So it was kind of like a what if prompt. And that's a really laborious process. It can be really hard if you have a creative block. It can be very challenging. And when I feel like I started getting into a stride with that work, my father had a brain tumor and was in the hospital. It ended up being in the hospital and in assisted living stuff for at least a year and a half. So my whole life changed at that point.
Sure.
I was teaching full time at multiple institutions, and I was the only person taking care of him. So that was 4 to 8 hours a day in those facilities beyond work. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, if I'm going to continue an art practice, it has to be something that I can do every day. When I get to the studio, I can have the capacity to just get to work, right? And not have to have that same kind of drawing process or like this sort of wandering creative broad net and then reel it back in to make a painting. I had to show up and work from what I had. And that was a really big reason why I started making still life paintings, because I thought, well, if I don't keep showing up in the studio, I'm not going to continue being an artist, right? Like you need to have that I don't know, you have to show up for the studio. And I think that's how it really started, of just very practical, like cans and bottles of just things that were around me. Mm-hmm. I didn't know where that was going, but I think it's felt really sustaining to be able to do that, because I think that makes it more about my own perception and vision rather than trying to make something up.
Is there any curation in terms of, like, when you say like bottles and cans and things like this in your studio, do you carefully arrange them first, or do you kind of just paint objectively, like where things are, that's how you capture it on the canvas?
It depends. Some paintings have a little bit more of a narrative to them. So there's a lot of paintings of tables where, throughout COVID, it was very helpful to think about it as a metaphor for what our lives looked like, thinking about what my table or desk looked like. That was my dining table, my office, my classroom, and my studio. And so I think there's something to be said for those kinds of cluttered spaces.
Is this one of them by any chance? I have a screen share up here. Can you see that?
That one's a recent one. So, oh, yes. Sorry, the screen is a little bit delayed.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so this one is my studio table. The numbered grid is a cutting mat that I have, that actually is sort of a remnant from work I did just after grad school, which was soft upholstery and curtains for historic replicas and contemporary designers. So I feel like that
That's cool.
craft element and that love of those kinds of textiles are always part of what I do too. So yeah, it was just my Zoom classroom, editing images, books that are kicking around, like the Gustin book and paint swatches, classroom demos. It's just a little bit of everything.
I do sense a bit of as I click through this next image. And listeners, sorry if you're listening to this episode on a podcast platform, it's also streaming on YouTube. So if you want to take a look at some of the visuals for what Laura and I are talking about right now, I just clicked over to this is a painting, right?
Yes.
What I'm looking at, yeah, so it's a painting of it looks like your daily planner. Like it says March at the top and then some dates and note like to-do lists and things like this. It's interesting that I just naturally clicked over to this image. I did not plan that because previously we were just looking at a still life of it looks like a workspace. Like Lauren mentioned, there's a laptop computer and art supplies on top of a like a cutting board, and I don't know if that's a planner or a checkbook or it's just a lot of stuff like a workspace. And then when we click over to the next image, it's a very organized. It's a painting of a page spread of your planner. So I'm wondering if I guess the first half of the question is if you looks like you're quite organized. And how does this like sense of organization, I guess, make its way into your art practice?
I think it's a little bit of both because it's also really hectic, right? If I didn't color code my calendar, I'd be pretty lost.
Oh, look at
And
that. I see the color coding. That's brilliant.
I think I even this is from about 2020. I think this is right before the COVID shutdown because I can see my friend Conchetta visited around then. It was just she was lucky to fly home um, as things were closing down. And I've had multiple jobs at one time, and I think, trying to live an artist's life is really challenging, and I think still even more challenging as a woman trying to do it. And it's just hard to find the right kind of like work life split. And so I think a lot of even the desk painting is about that in some way where the personal and the public sort of collide and things are both messy, but there they are anyway.
I'm curious, you said that you worked at multiple universities at the same time. Are you an adjunct professor by any chance?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. How does that I've been an adjunct professor for over a decade, and I got to a point recently where I don't know if I could handle it anymore, so I started like going back to school for something else at night, and then my university gave me like a temp full-time position, but it's just temp, so my brain is tired, and it's been hard to yeah, kind of hard to manage it. I'm wondering if you think like the adjunct lifestyle, is it working for you? Did you find a way to make it all work?
I don't think so. Still
That
doing it, but I don't know that anybody has because, you really don't get paid enough. You don't get any health care or benefits, and every 6 months you're essentially jobless, right? Like you're not sure when if the contracts are coming through, if they will, even if you have that promise of another class, it could be canceled for any reason. So, what you end up doing or what I end up doing is sort of overloading my schedule, crossing my fingers, and even all of that is a lot of labor that takes away from time in the studio.
And I'm curious, how do you, like I see in your, the painting of your planner here, you have studio time actually like written into your, do you still do that? Do you still have studio time written into your planner?
Not so much. I think that sort of for me depends on deadlines where lately I've actually just taken over my whole house as studio. So the dining table has been my space for a little bit. I guess coming off of the solo show I had last summer, this year has been a really interesting time to brainstorm again. So not in a way to like reinvent the wheel, but noticing in that exhibition almost everything was a studio still life. And so then I come back to this idea of, well, what if it goes outside the studio? What if it's more so in a domestic space? What if it goes outside a little bit? And so just trying to really brainstorm again and open up the possibilities for the next group of work.
Hmm. Hmm. And I would love to talk about maybe the aesthetic of your paintings, because color is, it seems like such an important part of your work. I'm actually going to do another screen share here to show off your palette a bit. Um, okay, fabulous. Yeah, you just have such a great sense of color. I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the importance of color in your work.
Sure. I think that color is really important to me because it's perceptual and because it's inventive. So yes, most of my colors are in the natural ballpark of what the objects and things are, but not always. I think there's a certain freedom to be able to change colors in the world that I'm creating so that they aren't necessarily naturalistic. Maybe they tap into a sense of feeling or something else, or mood or just like the quality of a time of day or whether it is inside or outside. Um, and I think for me, color also connects pretty deeply with the use of patterns and things that I would say in painting are feminine or have historically been called feminine. And, maybe what is pattern versus structure? What is something that, the way that we talk about feminine things in painting seem to be somewhat superfluous, where I think they're actually really important. So, the color makes structure just as much as the planes do. And maybe the planes seem more, there's a ruler in this painting. I think there's some humor to playing with the grid for me in that way, and then sort of messing with it with organic flowers and sort of agitating colors.
Mhm. I'm really interested in what you were comparing. Was it structure to pattern?
Maybe even a better phrasing would be the decorative to structure, right? Like if you think about architecture and, today a lot of our architecture is sleek. There is not a lot of ornamentation and it's very efficient. And I think that's sort of a world we have. And I think trying to cram as much pattern and color into a painting as possible is a way to just ask someone to think a little bit differently about that, because all of those things create a sense of space. They have meaning just as much as a structure does. And I think I don't know, it's just always something we have to keep aware of how they connect to each other.
Do you ever think about your work in relation to photography? Because it seems the way that you described it seems like it's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, right? Where photography has embedded in it this idea of objectivity and, a mirror of our reality. And it seems like you're trying to not completely negate that, but you're giving yourself the freedom to, yeah, I guess to be subjective with what you see in front of you.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's dead on. Where, we have so many photos, who needs another photo? And also to work from a photo becomes a very narrow process.
Mm.
And, this is something I talk to students about. Like, I think there's actually more invention possible when you're just looking at the world around you. Um, I'm not trying to replicate exactly what's going on in my still life. I'm trying to think about how I'm seeing. And
Mm.
and there's all kinds of quirks in there that are not just like glass on table. There's a lot of movement over time. There's a slowness to that observation, and there's this freedom for you to say what is going on in the world around you rather than relying on the photo to tell you.
Did I'm curious, like if non-art people when, because it sounds very much like your work is like painting, it's painting about painting in many ways, but when we look at it we see like still life and objects. So when you introduce your work to people who don't know you and your background and your wealth of knowledge, how do you often introduce your work? Like if people say, oh, you're an artist, what kind of work do you make? What do you say?
Um, hmm. Suppose I would say that I'm trying to make the everyday monumental, right? Like, even if the painting is small, that doesn't mean that the painting doesn't feel big or have the same kind of impact, but that I'm trying to get someone to think about how they see the everyday a little bit differently.
Well said.
Thanks.
Well said.
I
Do you
try.
do you think do you ever say, "Oh, I'm a still life painter"?
Yeah, sometimes if it's like if you want to stop the conversation pretty
Yeah.
quickly, it's a good way to do it.
It's a great answer.
I've got two options. Do you want to keep talking or do you want me to just sound boring?
Touche. So, in talking about your work, so we spoke so far about your interest in the still life, kind of as a form. We spoke about your interest in color, but we really didn't talk too much yet about the objects themselves. Is there any significance to the objects that you choose to paint?
Yes, and it varies a little bit whether it's maybe a thing on the table that a man-made thing that somebody would use to the flowers. I think they also have their own kind of content to them. Um, a lot of the stuff is perceptual in terms of not just thinking about what an object looks like, but what I might be meditating on while I paint or who I might be meditating on. So pretty early on, there was a mug that came in that I had found in my basement that said, "I heart my mom." And I loved how ubiquitous it was. Everybody has this like, "I love my mom" idea, right? Like, not that everybody does, everyone's relationships are different, but there's something very shared about that kind of, even something so general. But when you focus on it with your own experience and memories, it becomes something else. And so that's something I really like about everyday objects, that you can meditate on them. I mean, even thinking about Morandi, how every painting is of the same objects and yet we get multitudes out of them. I think that that is hopefully the approach that one sees in my painting. If I'm going to paint the same glass over and over, what do I get out of it, out of that repetition?
Is that something
Um,
you do? Do you photograph? I'm sorry. Do you paint the same object on repeat in multiple paintings?
yes, there's so many of the same things. I think a glass is pretty particular for me, and it's really the drinking glass I have, but it's a funny, like, it's a cheap IKEA glass that I assume hundreds of thousands of people have also, but
Let me see
I
if I
think it
could do
does
a
such.
screen share. Is it the first image on your website here? Is this the glass you're talking about? Here, let's find it so we can give a visual here. Screen share. This one's pretty generic.
It is that one, and that one
It is that one, yeah.
I
Okay.
left the pattern off of it, so sometimes I'll treat it different ways every day. It has this little like I don't know, it's like a pattern of X's across it. So in this painting, I didn't even bother including it, but in other ones I do, and I just, it's the same thing every time, and yet I get to treat it differently.
I
Uh,
love that.
and then the
Um,
flowers, I think,
oh, is this it? Is this
no,
it?
that's a little vase. I mean, again, a lot of these little bud vases were my mother's and my grandmother's, and they may go back a little bit further than that too. So some of them are really sentimental in that way, um, and then the flower content, I feel like so much of thinking about perception has to do with time, and so I get to paint these things at all these different stages. And the flowers, if anybody's ever tried painting live flowers, they move constantly.
Mm.
So they're, even though they're cut flowers, they're very much alive depending on what is happening in the studio. So I like pairing them as they're drying with patterns of flowers, which maybe have a little bit longer of a life in some way, and yet I'm fixing them all permanently in the same painting together. So I like that sort of range of the ephemeral that happens in them.
Oh, is this one here? Is this the pattern on the IKEA glass?
Yes. And again, treated completely differently. Another one, yeah, same glass. There it
Same
is
thing.
again.
I made a note as you were talking earlier, and I forgot to ask. You said that it's even more challenging for women to kind of keep up with all of the things in terms of being an artist. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean there?
Sure. I think of it especially in relationship to adjuncting because we are on these finite contracts. We don't have health insurance through those jobs, and or it's always up in the air what we're going to do next. And when I look around, I see an overwhelming number of women in adjuncting positions and also in admin positions in the schools that I work in. And I think maybe the full-time jobs are a little bit more balanced in gender, but at the same time, I see a lot of women that don't have that security. And I think that especially extends to decisions about whether or not to become a mother or when, because you're on this
Mm,
contract situation where you're not going to get maternity leave. You don't really get sick days the same way a full-time faculty member does. And if you take a break or have to leave, you're sort of out of the like last one on, first one off kind of list of adjuncting. You're not
mm,
guaranteed another position the next semester. So
mhm,
I think it makes it feel very fragile.
mm. Do you think the same is true for women in the art field? Do you think it's a more challenging landscape for them there also?
I think so. And I was even listening to, there's a book, was it Get the Picture? Um, and I was listening to the audiobook, and even in there, written like this year, last year, they mentioned that galleries decide not to represent women if they think they're going to have a child soon, right? Like, so there's a whole, like, why are we even saying that in 2024 or 23 or this
Yeah,
century? It's bananas.
it is bananas. Yeah, and I'm so impressed with all of you do. So you teach at multiple universities. You're an artist. You're also the co-director of an art space, Ortega y Gasset. Did I pronounce that correctly? I don't speak
Yeah.
Spanish. um, and yeah, I guess I'm wondering if I'd also love to learn a little bit about your role in that space. So you're based in Philly, but the art space is in New York, right?
Yes.
Okay,
So
great. Yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about the space, that'd be great.
sure. The gallery is in Gowanus, so it's in Brooklyn, which is actually very convenient for me to get to just from Philly and in terms of where the highways are. So
Mm,
um, I feel very close by. I make it to most openings. We meet bi-weekly on Zoom. So we've been doing that since, I don't know, before COVID, certainly. I think I joined in 2017 and we
uh,
celebrated our 10th anniversary last summer. So I think I joined about 3 years in.
okay, amazing.
We always have this organization where about half of us are in New York City and half of us are out of the city. And obviously people move around and things like that. But it's very helpful for what I do is essentially all the billing and bookkeeping and taxes and stuff like that. Our member that is in Chicago organizes our website and our archives, and others that are in person are more likely to do install, deinstall a little bit more often, or just, manage our gallery assistants and things like
Mhm,
that. So
mhm.
um, I think it's really well balanced, even though there are challenges to, people want it like it would be nice to go there more often, but I'm still close enough.
Yeah. And is
Uh,
it an artist run space?
yes,
I
so there are
remember.
7 of us. We are all artists with, one or more jobs each.
Mhm,
Many of us are adjunct faculty or full-time faculty. Some of us have like non-art jobs.
mhm.
Um, yeah, so
Yeah.
it's a really nice balance of people and skills and um, yeah, what were you going to follow up with?
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you, if maybe you could offer some advice to younger artists. I guess I want to ask for a couple of specific pieces of advice, but since we were talking about the gallery space, maybe I'll start with this one. If you have, because you are co-director of an art space, do you have any advice for young artists who are looking to show their work? Like, are there any like things you should not do in terms of approaching, gallery owners, gallery directors, and things that might actually get your work seen?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would say that my advice would be coming from a specific perspective as an artist run space where maybe a commercial gallery would have different rules and procedures.
True,
But,
true.
if people just show up to our exhibits and say hi. Like, we are so grateful for that because we're happy to perform this kind of service for our community and bring people together. So, that it would be weird if you came into somebody else's show and said, "Hey, what about my work?" Like, very
Yeah.
quickly, like, just be reasonable about those sort of uh socially aware things, like congratulations first. And let that stuff come up naturally. But
Yeah, yeah.
we know who comes to the gallery repeatedly. We know who is excited about our programming. And I think it's just about us building community as much as it is wanting people to show up for that.
I love that.
Um, we do one open call per year. So I've really learned a lot about applications and how, we review them all together. So when you have 7 to 9 people in a room reviewing hundreds of applications, you learn a lot about how other people think about them, and you start to notice what becomes consistent. So, very basically, if you don't have really great photos, you're not going to get past stage one because that's the
Yeah.
first thing everybody looks at. And then if somebody's excited about the photos, they're going to start reading some more and like ask questions like, what is this work about? And all of that. So, great photos and then really practical, helpful writing that just illuminates what the artist is thinking about. So,
And when you say an open call, is this for solo exhibitions or a group exhibition or?
yeah, so we do one for a solo exhibition each year, and it's
Okay.
usually two built into one. Our space is divided into two different galleries. One is more site responsive, and the other one is more of like a rectangle that, it could be thought of in many different ways. So um, the site responsive one is just sort of a quirky L-shaped space, so it just works much better to create some kind of immersive installation or site responsive element to it.
Yeah, very great. And yeah, so I'd also like to get your kind of advice on artists who are doing like all the things, right? Because there are so many of us who are struggling with, prioritizing work versus studio work, and then of course all the other layers of being human, the social relationships and family relationships. Yeah, do you have any advice for how to make it work?
I mean, taking it one step at a time, because I feel like I'm still figuring out how to make it work, and so are a lot of people that look like they have it all together.
That's a good point.
I mean, you never know what's going on behind the really slick social media. So,
Yeah, right. Yeah,
there
that's
are
good
ups
to
and
remember.
downs to all of it. I think the key is that you can't do everything well at one time. I will, after, adjuncting and working with OIG for so many years, I know there are going to be lulls in the studio, and I know there are going to be times like, we don't do a lot of gallery shows that are a lot of work in the summer. So I get my time back then from school and from the gallery. So um, I think it's about not getting frustrated with those things that you aren't constantly juggling. It's okay to let something sit on the back burner for a minute until you have the focus to get to it. It's just, I think when you are sort of just over spread out, that's when all the work suffers.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Yeah, that's great. Do you have any upcoming shows?
not right now. I feel like I am just emerging out of my brainstorming phase. I've started having, some friends over to see what I've been up to. The work that I've been doing at home is mostly on Yupo paper, which is that plastic translucent paper, and they're almost all watercolors. And I've just been trying to make a lot of one-shot paintings. So I've now got this like massive pile of drawings that I'm ready to turn into paintings. So I feel like I'm in
Oh,
an
that's exciting.
incubation phase as the summer comes up, which is very exciting.
Yeah, that's really exciting. You mentioned this paper. Are your sketches smaller than your paintings would be? And I did forget to ask that. What size are your finished paintings ish? Do they range?
There's a pretty big range. So
Okay.
the smallest paintings are about maybe like 11 by 14-ish. And then I have sort of a medium size. I always like these sizes that are a little bit more square. So there's just an odd amount of tension to that proportion. So the medium size is 21 by 24. And then I've got a larger size that's like I think that one's 40 by 46, and then I'll work it up to like 5 feet by 7 feet
Nice.
as well. So there's
Nice.
just, it depends on what the work is for, if it's for a show or what size space, or if they're all meant to kind of exist together for a little bit. And right now the drawings are really big. So I think the largest size for that Yupo paper is almost 30 by 40 inches. And it's been a really nice exercise to sort of loosen up my gesture. So thinking in terms of color and gesture, but it's not the kind of material where you can work in layers. So you sort of just either have to get it right or start over again. So it's sort of freeing in that way.
Yeah, very exciting. Well, I can't wait to see the work that you produce over the summer. And yeah, I'm so grateful that we were able to chat. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in next week as I'll be speaking with Hannah Washburn, a Beacon-based artist who hand sews sculptures out of recycled textiles. Hope to see y'all then. Have a great week. Bye-bye.